Years ago, before I entered the seminary, I remember teaching a bunch of grade school kids confirmation. So at a certain point, I was asking them to name particular commandments. So I'd say to them, for instance, what's the fifth commandment? And after giving a bunch of wrong answers, one kid finally said, I don't know, but it's thou shalt not something. I remember thinking to myself, well, that says a lot there, doesn't it? Now, obviously, it's kind of a funny story, but it says a lot about how people tend to perceive the Catholic faith, or Christianity in general. And so, for example, the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he says, look, if you want to try to discredit the merits of Christianity, don't try to attack it on the basis of truth or reason. And so, for example, don't try to discredit the various proofs for the existence of God. What you want to do instead is try to show how the Christian thing is incompatible with our natural desire for happiness. Because it's kind of interesting how the human mind works. Because if you think about it, if we perceive that something is incompatible with our desire for human happiness, even if it's right, even if it's true, we couldn't care less. We're thinking to ourselves, look, I don't have anything to do with that particular thing because all I care about at the end of the day is that I'm actually happy. And you see, what this means for us, practically speaking, is that when we talk about our faith, and certainly when we try to evangelize, it's not enough for us to simply throw facts at people or to simply say true things. We need to show, first of all, that we are happy through the witness of our lives. And secondly, we need to show an explicit connection between the happiness that we feel and our lived out faith experience. In the absence of that, our efforts to evangelize or convince people about the veracity of our faith will come across as being somewhat hollow. And so one way to kind of clearly illustrate this thing we're talking about today is to expound upon the fourth commandment, which of course is the exhortation to keep holy the Sabbath day. Because if you think about it, how do most people look at the Sabbath day? Well, I would suggest that most people typically look at the Sabbath day as a day where the church says, I can't have any fun. Like I can't go shopping, I can't do things I would ordinarily like to do. The only thing I'm allowed to do in a certain sense is to go to Mass. And in a world where I can't even go to Mass because of the world pandemic, it begs the question, how the heck am I supposed to keep holy this Sabbath day? And on that note, one comes to mind is a conversation I had with a priest friend of mine shortly after the world pandemic sort of came to a head. And basically what he said to me was this: even though most people would agree that the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian faith, as we see, for example, in the writings of Vatican II, what people are demonstrating through their lack of understanding of the Sabbath day is that they have no understanding of the underlying mountain, if you will. In other words, even though a lot of people would agree, again, that the Eucharist is supposed to be the peak of the Christian thing, a lot of those same people have no idea about what's supposed to actually undergird that peak experience. Such, for example, when it comes to the Sabbath day, in the absence of publicly celebrated Mass, a lot of people have no idea what you're supposed to do on Sunday. And so given all that, I thought what we might do is give you some key principles as to how to understand the Sabbath day. So not so much concrete things as to what to actually do, but again, key principles to develop a proper understanding of the Sabbath day, such that you might creatively come up with things that you might do concretely in your own particular circumstance. And so the first thing that comes to mind is the need for us to revisit the biblical foundation for why we're supposed to observe the Sabbath day to begin with, which you find in the book of Exodus chapter 20 and the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now what's interesting is that in these two particular chapters from the Old Testament, you find an exact same listing of the Ten Commandments with one key exception. And that is the particular motivation for observing the fourth commandment, which again is keep holy the Sabbath day. And so what you find, for example, in the book of Exodus is this exhortation to observe the Sabbath day because we're called to participate in the rest of the Creator God. And so if you think back to the book of Genesis, God obviously created the universe in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And so the whole idea is that in thanksgiving to God the Creator, we participate in the rest of the experience on the seventh day, again as articulated in the book of Genesis. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, what you find is that we're called to participate in the rest of the Sabbath day, to give thanks to God for being a liberator and indeed a redeemer, if you will. And so, as you might recall, in the Old Testament, God very famously liberated the people of Israel from the clutches of Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. And so in thanksgiving again for God being liberator and redeemer, we're called to participate in his rest. Now, obviously, as people of the New Covenant, we don't have this immediate experience of having been enslaved in Egypt. I mean, hopefully that goes without saying. But at the same time, we do have this experience of having been liberated from the tyranny of sin and death through the suffering and death and resurrection of Christ the Lord. And so given all that, it is still fitting for us to give thanks to God for being creator and redeemer by participating in the rest of the Sabbath day. Now, all this talk about the biblical motivations for observing the Sabbath day, quite apart from being a theological footnote to bring up simply at Catholic cocktail parties, it actually has major implications for how we're supposed to live out the Sabbath day from a practical standpoint. And so, for example, I can only enter into the rest of the Sabbath day insofar as I have clarity of God being the creator of the universe. And not in the sense of simply being the one who created the universe billions of years ago, but the one who sustains me in being even now. Because if you think about it, if I have this great clarity that God is the one who constantly loves me into existence, moment to moment, well then therefore I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be busy all the time. I don't have to carry the day because God is carrying the day. And so therefore I can just let go and just be because again, God is creator. And of course the same principle applies when it comes to God's identity as liberator and redeemer. And so the whole idea, again, is that I can only enter into rest that's being offered to me through the Sabbath day, insofar as I have clarity that God is the liberator and redeemer of the world. Because in the absence of that, what am I left with? I'm left with fear. Fear of death, fear of my humanity, fear of my frailty, fear of my sinfulness. Whereas on the other hand, if Jesus Christ truly is everything the church says that he is, if he is truly liberator and redeemer, if he has truly suffered and died for my sins, such that I might live, well then I can just relax and let go, and rest in my identity as a sinner in need of redemption. Or in the words of Pope Francis, I can just let go and allow myself to be a sinner who has been looked upon by the Lord. Okay, so again, that's kind of the first thing, to have a proper understanding of the biblical foundations for why we observe the Sabbath day to begin with. But you see, the second thing is this. We also need to have a proper understanding of the philosophical distinction between the useless on the one hand and the useful on the other. You know, the great philosopher Aristotle talks about this when he says that the useful is basically that which is full of use. So it's basically what we might call a means to an end. Whereas on the other hand, the useless is the end. It's the thing that we're ultimately called to rest in. And so to use a really easy example, Bishop Robert Barron says, imagine you're fixing a car. So fixing a car is obviously a very useful endeavor, which is meant to lead to another useful endeavor, namely driving the car to get to a particular place. But the whole point is that even though it's good to engage in a series of useful events, ultimately they are supposed to be directed to something which is finally useless, such as hanging out with friends, enjoying a baseball game, or watching a movie. Along the same lines, this American priest, Father John Ricardo, says very provocatively that friends are meant to be useless. Which is to say this, the moment I try to ascribe a use to my friend, that person ceases to be a friend, because friends are not meant to be means to an ends, they're meant to be ends unto themselves. So again, friends are meant to be useless. Okay, so how does this apply to the Sabbath day? Well, perhaps I might suggest that one reason why it's so difficult for many of us to rest on the Sabbath day is because we have no idea about how to apply this distinction between the useful and the useless. And so the whole idea is that even though it's good at times, again, to engage in a series of useful activities, to achieve the things you want to achieve, or to do the things that you're meant to do, that's precisely what you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath day. And one of the best articulations of this point is found in the writings of Dr. Michael McNaughton, who wrote this really great book called Getting Work Right. And so to paraphrase, what Dr. McNaughton says is basically this. If you do unnecessary work on the Sabbath day, obviously it kills it. In other words, if you look at the Sabbath day as, for example, my catch-up day, where I try to do all those things that I couldn't get to throughout the course of the previous week, it just totally kills the whole thing, and you don't obtain the rest that you're meant to receive in the context of the Sabbath day. But you see, what's interesting is that he says, in addition to that, if you approach the Sabbath day as a day where I'm supposed to rest, such that I might work better on Monday, still kills it. And the reason why is because there's still the element of efficiency or functionality. And so given all that, what you're actually supposed to do on the Sabbath day is get rid of any sense of efficiency or functionality or accomplishment and to simply focus on being useless. In other words, rather than look at Sunday as yet another day where I'm trying to be productive, or I'm trying to be efficient, or I'm trying to be useful, if you will, realize instead that God actually calls you on Sunday to be useless. Sunday is the day that you're called to do useless things with your useless family and your useless friends. And it sounds weird, but when you try it, when you try to live that way on the Sabbath day, it actually works. And in fact, it is the only way to obtain the rest that God offers you in the context of that day. Okay, so one more bit of advice when it comes to cultivating the spirit of the Sabbath day. So basically the whole idea here is you need to learn to incorporate more contemplative prayer into your regular routine. You need to learn to incorporate more contemplative prayer into your regular routine. And so think of it like this. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, basically there are 3 types of prayer which are identified. Vocal prayer, meditative prayer, and contemplative prayer. So vocal prayer is basically prayer which involves the spoken word, right? Meditative prayer is something which involves the use of your different faculties, like your intellectual faculties, your imaginative faculties. Whereas contemplative prayer is simply kind of resting in the Lord. So this whole idea of, I look at him, he looks at me. That's contemplative prayer. Now, the thing I want to impress upon you is that when people pray, if they pray, I think what they're doing is that they're building their prayer routine around primarily vocal prayer and meditative prayer, but not so much around contemplative prayer. And so, for example, you'll see a lot of people thumbing through prayer cards. And what is that but vocal prayer? Again, prayer that's built around the spoken word. Or you'll find a lot of people doing things like Lectio Divina, where they're doing a very kind of close prayerful reading of the daily Mass readings. And what is that but, again, meditative prayer, prayer involving the use of the intellect and the use of the imagination. But the thing I want to suggest to you is that even though it's really important to incorporate some element of vocal prayer and meditative prayer into your regular prayer routine, you shouldn't be doing these things to the exclusion of so-called contemplative prayer. Because you see, the great danger of limiting your prayer routine simply to vocal and meditative prayer is that you run the risk of reducing your prayer life simply to a continuation of your already active and busy life. Whereas on the other hand, if you try very intentionally, again, to incorporate some element of contemplative prayer, then you create the space for peace. Then you create the space for rest. And these in turn can create very precious moments and opportunities of encounter with the one living and true God. St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, he has a really great quote in this regard where he says basically this: when you're engaged in contemplative prayer and you find that moment where your heart's at rest, just stay there. Just stay there without any sense of anxiety to move forward until your heart is satisfied. And so to use an analogy, and this is from the writings of Father Timothy Gallagher, imagine you're looking for a friend in an apartment building. And so, for example, let's say on the first day you're looking for your friend, and you find him right away. So you find him right away on the first floor of the building, west side of the building, room A. Okay, fine. Next day, though, you're looking for him again, and he's on a different floor. He's in a different room. And you're looking, you're searching, and eventually you find him again. You find him, though, on the 5th floor, east side of the building, room H. In any case, the whole idea is that the moment you find your friend, you stop, because that's the whole point of the exercise. And of course, the same principle applies when it comes to the spiritual life. And so let's say you're doing some form of meditative prayer, like you're praying with the Bible or you're going over some work of spiritual reading, and you find that thing that you're looking for. Whether we're talking about a sense of peace or hope or consolation, rest, love, however you want to frame it, don't keep on going. Again, it's that quote from St. Ignatius, right? Don't keep on going, but instead stay there. Rest in the moment. Abide in the moment without any sense of anxiety and move forward until your heart is satisfied. In other words, don't try to move on to the next series of useful activities. Learn to rest and abide in the useless because you've found your friend in the apartment building. So stay there. Again, abide in the moment. Abide in that stance of contemplative prayer until your heart is finally satisfied. Now, obviously, we've covered a lot of ground here, but hopefully you can see how these different things we've been talking about today can really help you to bone up your sense of spirituality with regards to the Sabbath day, which again can be especially helpful in these times where public Mass isn't really accessible to a whole lot of people. And so even though all of us obviously long to go back to a time where anyone can go to Mass whenever they want to, in the meantime, if you keep these different principles in mind, again, the properly biblical foundation behind the observance of the Sabbath day, the philosophical distinction between the useful and the useless, and the importance of incorporating some element of contemplative prayer into your regular routine, these things can go a long way to help you keep the Sabbath day holy in the midst of these challenging circumstances. And may God bless you all.